All right, and our last speaker for this morning session is Leland Brown. Leland has a day job as a software engineer and does cartography as a hobby. This interest grew out of his love of both mathematics and hiking and a desire to make better maps of the San Gabriel Mountains near his home in the Los Angeles area. This is Leland's 8th NACIS conference. Thank you.
Hello, and I think you'll see my love for both mathematics and the San Gabriel Mountains throughout my presentation today. So I've taken the liberty of slightly changing my title toward Texture Shading 2.0. Some of these ideas are a little more still in development than I'd hoped at this point, but I'll show you what I've been working on. So texture shading is an existing technique for representing mountainous terrain, as you see an example here. These are some of the benefits that I'd like to retain as I make improvements to the algorithm. And one in particular that I'm going to be focusing on today a lot is this scale invariance property, which I've defined here. So briefly, the idea is that as you focus in on smaller and smaller details in the image, those details should be retained, but with gradually reducing contrast. So that retains the hierarchical structure of the actual terrain that has a sort of fractal self-similarity. The same thing results when you maintain the scale invariance properties. It's very useful, I find, for terrain images. These are some of the drawbacks of the current texture shading technique that I'd like to improve on. And today I hope to show some progress on the first two and perhaps a little bit on the third one as well. So the issue with the directional versus non-directional, this is what I call a non-directional or an isotropic algorithm. It doesn't have any preferred orientation, unlike a traditional hill shading that uses a particular illumination direction. And what I've found and others have found, and I know Pat has mentioned this in a presentation he did a couple years ago, is that a terrain representation seems to benefit from having some of each, that you need both the directional and the non-directional component to get the best results. So in the case of the texture shading with the missing directional component for certain types of terrain, it doesn't look very nice. And then likewise, there are other cases where adding this isotropic component really benefits. So what people have typically done then in using texture shading is to combine it with a traditional shaded relief, taking the two images and blending them together, say, with a transparency effect. And so here's an example just using a straight 50-50 transparency, and you get a nice result, but unfortunately you've lost the scale invariance property because of the fact that the hill shading and the way it's generalized does not, the contrast in the details doesn't reduce at the same rate as the texture shading. So when you combine the two, you don't retain that consistent effect. And if we were to zoom in on this image and look at it in more detail, you'll see that at this scale, the generalization from the hill shading has done quite a bit of smoothing, and more so than the texture shading. So in some sense, at the finest zoom levels, the detail is all being provided now by the texture shading. So that 50-50 mix that you chose that you thought looked nice isn't really applying it across different scales. So the way we can fix this is by changing the way we do the smoothing, the generalization in the shaded relief. So the top row here shows a standard Gaussian smoothing technique, which has an adjustable parameter called a blur radius. So essentially what's happening is everything below that size of feature is being removed, leaving a smoother terrain. And you can adjust that as you see fit for the amount of smoothing you like. So an alternative is a scale invariant smoothing, where rather than removing all the details below a certain size, again, the details are being reduced in contrast more and more as the details get smaller, but never completely removed. And in this case, what I mean by contrast is a vertical exaggeration factor. So this is in many ways similar to resolution bumping, which is another technique for doing generalization, particularly on small scale terrains where you start with a relatively smooth generalization and then add back in some details, but with a lower level of vertical exaggeration. So this is the same thing, but then continuing that on continuously through multiple levels of detail. I think of this as kind of a resolution bumping on steroids, if you will. So the scale invariant hill shading now, using that scale invariant smoothing, is probably a quite useful technique in its own right. but then you get an additional benefit when you combine it with the texture shading. So in the case of, in both of these cases, instead of having, as I mentioned, a blur radius, there's an exponent in the algorithm that controls the level of how rapidly the details drop off, or how rapidly the contrast drops off with smaller and smaller details. If we're careful to choose the same exponent for both of these images, then when we combine them, we retain the scale invariance property, and we get what I'm going to call directional texture shading. So in this case now, if we zoom in on that, you can see that the zoomed image retains a lot of the same visual character as the full image, and in particular, notice that the ridges are much sharper than they were before. So here again is just a comparison of the two smoothing techniques, and then adding in the texture shading layer to both of them. This is the result. So at this point, I want to use the room here makes a nice example. I can say for the image on the left, because of a particular blur radius has been chosen for the smoothing for the shaded relief layer, people sitting closer to the front of the room might be able to see this a lot more, see a lot more detail in the image, and might actually find that it's smooth more than they would like, that they could stand to see a little more detail at that viewing distance. Whereas the people in the back of the room, this is probably already too cluttered, and you maybe would prefer a little more smoothing. The image on the right, however, you may feel that it's got too much detail or too little detail, but either way, that experience should be similar for everyone in the room, regardless of the viewing distance, because of the scale invariance. So in both cases, the smoothing is tunable, but on the left, the smoothing would need to be adjusted differently for different viewing distances or in an online map for different zoom levels, whereas on the right, the directional texture shading, whatever smoothing parameter you pick should give a similar experience regardless of the viewing conditions. And then just one more example with a somewhat smaller scale map. This is the Sierras, and this again is the two smoothing techniques. And one thing I notice here is with the scale invariant, even without adding the texture shading layer, there's a lot more texture there in the smoother areas because it hasn't completely eliminated those small details. They've just been reduced in size. So, and then this is what you get when you add the texture shading layer to the two. All right. So hopefully the directional texture shading has now succeeded in turning those first two into positives, and while retaining the original benefits. And I hope to do some future work on resolving some of the other issues. So changing gears now a little bit, I want to talk about some of the tools that for making this happen and some additional ideas that we can pursue. So derivative operators are a common thing that we can use for producing shaded relief images. A gradient you may be familiar with is a mathematical operator for computing the slope and aspect angle that we use for traditional hill shading. And then probably a new vocabulary term for most of you is a Hessian matrix. This is the set of second derivatives, and just as for the first derivatives, the gradient, there are two components which can be represented as slope and aspect. With second derivatives, there are actually three components. The more well-known being the Laplacian, which gives information about whether the terrain is locally convex or concave, and the other two components giving orientation information of the orientation of a ridge or a canyon, as well as distinguishing the 6 types of curvature that I have listed here. So now if you think about a real terrain, though, a particular point on a terrain is not necessarily objectively, say, a ridge or a saddle. You can imagine a major ridge across a mountain range. As you travel along that ridge, you may go up and down over peaks and saddles. And so a particular point on one of those saddles, is that a point on a ridge or is it a point on a saddle? Well, of course, it's both. It depends on the scale that you're looking at. So on a broader scale, that's part of a large ridge. And on a finer scale, it's a saddle on the ridge. And there may even be a little bump on the saddle, which represents very locally a peak. And so ideally, we'd like to represent that information at all those scales on the map in a way that we can read all of that. The derivatives are not really going to do that for us, though, because it's just going to measure that at one particular scale that we can have to choose ahead of time. So the solution to this problem is what we call fractional derivatives. So for each of the items on the previous page, there's a corresponding fractional analog. And these are a bit difficult to explain precisely in mathematical terms, but you can think of them as sort of fuzzy derivatives that are aggregating information over a wide range of scales in a way that produces this scale invariant property. So these are really the tools that allow us to do the scale invariance. Now, you may be thinking, how are we going to represent all this information just in a grayscale map? So my value at a particular pixel is going to be a 0 to 255. How is that going to tell me that it's a ridge at one scale and a saddle at another scale? And of course, the individual pixel value is not going to do that. But what's going to give us that information is the relationship between the pixels. So you're going to see that that point is brighter or darker than the neighboring points at a certain scale. And your eye can actually then look at the image and compare it on the small scale and a large scale and get that various information. So if you think about it, the original digital elevation model has all this information in it. From that, you can extract the information of whether you're on a ridge, a saddle, at different scales, and so forth. It's just not in a form that's easy for a human to look at the original DEM image and extract that information. So our goal as cartographers then is to massage the data, put it into a form that is more easy for us to visually extract that information. So now, having provided the two fractional gradient components and the three fractional Hessian components, we have a set of ingredients, I'll call them, that we can put together in a myriad ways, all of which can produce scale invariant terrain maps. So before looking at my last set of examples, here's a way of kind of visualizing some ways of coloring the terrain. So if we just focus on the fractional gradient, again, that's going to give us a slope and aspect, or we can call them a fractional slope and fractional aspect. And at a particular point in the terrain, we could plot that on this plot with the flat area being in the center of the circle, and then the steeper areas being on the edges of the circle in the direction corresponding to the aspect. And then we can choose how we want to color that. The first image is, which we've already seen, the scale invariant hillshading, where the brightest part of the plot is a little bit to the northwest in the direction of the lighting. We can shade it simply according to steepness, just according to the radius on the plot, or we can use color to show both the slope and the aspect angle. Likewise, we can make a similar plot for the Hessian components. If we ignore the orientation, we have two components, and here the vertical component is the Laplacian, which is what fractional Laplacian is what I've been using up to this point in the texture shading. And so that would give you a high value for a peak or a ridge, a medium value for a plain or a saddle, and a low value for a pit or a canyon. But we really are unable to distinguish those pairs of curvature types with just the Laplacian. So now, having the additional coordinate, we can actually tell a peak from a ridge, a plain from a saddle, and so forth. And if we choose, we can color those in different ways. Here are some color schemes that we'll look at in a moment. So this is the original texture shading using just a straight fractional Laplacian. And one of the things I want to try to do here is bring out a little more detail in the desert area in the upper right, while retaining the nice look of the mountain. So if I, looking at the plot in the corner, if I increase the contrast in the center there for the flatter areas, now we do get more detail in the desert. Unfortunately, the trade-off is we've lost a little bit of sharpness on the ridges. And so this would be a compromise then between those two that I think works pretty well. This is a plot of just the fractional gradient steepness for the same. This is again as the San Gabriel Mountains, of course. And then this is using color with the fractional gradient. Notice with the, of course, the saturation indicates the steepness. The more saturated colors are steeper areas. Notice that the ridges remain sharp even with the smoothing. And you can see the importance of the smoothing if we take that out and just plot the ordinary gradient computed locally, that it's just very noisy. This is not perhaps a useful map, but a nice artistic effect. If I give you a close-up of that. So here we've colored, everything that's curved is white. So ridges and valleys are the same color. And so only the black areas are the smoothly sloping or flat areas. And you can see there's very little in this mountain range that's flat at all. It's a very rugged mountain range. And then my last image is what I call ridginess. So here, now I'm beginning to distinguish between the peaks and the ridges. So linear features, the ridges are bright colored, the canyons are dark colored, and then the peaks and the saddles are just closer to a medium gray. So as you move along the ridges, you can now pick out the peaks as darker spots along those ridges where the color changes a bit. And of course, there are many other things we could start to do with these components that we have now. And in fact, most of these images, I've either used the gradient or the Hessian. And of course, you can combine the two, as we've done with the directional texture shading. And so there are many more opportunities, I think, available to explore this space of scale invariant operators. That's my talk. Thank you.